So let's get into it. Innovation is moving at the speed of AI, which means your IP strategy can no longer be confined by old rules. Whoops. I don't even know how to say that. Defensibility drives valuation. Starting us off today is an essential session presented by Elevate IP Alberta, Todd Bailey, Chief IP Officer and General Counsel at Scale AI. And Danielle Gifford, Director of AI at PwC Canada, will moderate this conversation on how to transform your IP into an engine for investment readiness and competitive strength. So let's give it up for Todd and Danielle.
Yeah, I'm moderating.
And you're coming up with us too.
I am. Cameron, it's nice to meet you, Danielle.
Hello, everyone. We also have to welcome Arjun. Thanks for coming this morning, the start of the day. Hopefully not too many people were held back by the car accident nearby. Perfect. So yes, before we get into talking about defensibility by design, well, I should introduce myself. My name is Cameron Smithers. I'm the education manager at Elevate IP. So I oversee a lot of the educational development in terms of new educational resources, class content, as well as events like this when we work with great partners within the ecosystem. And one thing I'm very grateful that I get to do is I'm from Edmonton, so I know a lot more of what's going on Treaty 6, and I feel it's very fortunate I get to acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Buguni, the Gaina First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and the Goodstoney First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation within Alberta, Nose Hill Métis District 5, and Elbow Métis District 6. And before we introduce, I guess, our speakers in a little bit more detail, I always think it's important to kind of ground ourselves with our audience and get a better sense of who does what so that our answers are best reflected in who's here. So just by a quick show of hands, I'm going to ask where you fall under in these demographics. So if you're an investor, got one investor over there. I would say, let's call them early innovators, so pre having started your company. No early innovators. Entrepreneurs. And service providers, like organizations, such as a lot of service providers. Now, also to get a sense of your experience with AI, has anybody not used AI before? So no ChatGPT. I was expecting that as kind of the response around here. Who uses it occasionally, maybe a couple times a day? Okay. Who would go so far as saying that they're a power user and use it for all sorts of different things, personal life and work? Yeah, I got a fair number of power users. And then I would say this is the highest level, and Arjun falls under this. Who's building AI products or services? Okay, a small group of people, but it's nice to see that it's happening. And then just out of curiosity, what industries do you find yourselves in? Healthcare? Oh, we do have more healthcare than I've expected. I would say like deep tech in terms of more like tangible things. Okay. Software as a service? And who is just building AI? Okay, yeah, that's the high level. I wouldn't have anticipated many people to be in that space. Now, I think we can go across. We'll go just this way, and everybody can just say a couple introduce yourself in a couple sentences about who you are and what you've done, and yeah, go from there.
Want to start with you, Todd?
No, go ahead.
All right. Great to.
Mine's not on.
Hello. Hello. Okay. Nice to be here this morning with everyone. Really excited for the panel. So my name is Danielle Gifford. I'm a managing director of AI at PwC Canada. So in my role, I wear two different hats. One of them is focusing on our Western Canada market. So really looking and understanding, what are our service offerings, what do we bring to market, all the way from strategy, governance, literacy, to how we build and deploy models, traditional models, generative AI models, as well as agentic AI models. And then the other hat that I roll is really in our emerging solutions. And so with PwC, we're a 150-year-old risk firm. So you can imagine innovating inside a risk firm isn't necessarily always easy. But what it means is we really need to change the way that we deliver some of the things we do. So application migrations, cloud migrations, data migrations. And so I'm part of a team that's really helping develop new and commercial novel technologies, leveraging some of the new applications out there like large language models to change the way that we do things. The other thing that I do is I teach at the University of Calgary, so I'm teaching an AI and business course for their MBAs. So that's a little bit about me. Maybe over to you.
Thanks, Danielle. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Arjun Puri. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Symbiotic AI. Symbiotic AI is a digital health company. We build clinical decision support solutions that improve cardiovascular care, heart care. My background's in data science, clinical informatics, medical and imaging informatics, and really digital health innovation across the board. Second-time founder. Previous to getting into entrepreneurship, I used to work at digital health innovation at Alberta Health Services, helping review and adopt solutions that made sense for the health system.
Oh, I'm alive. And I'm Todd Bailey, last and certainly least, I guess. But so I am with the Scale AI Supercluster, which is an entity within the federal government Supercluster program, and we're supporting AI commercialization and adoption. And I'm going to talk about what Scale AI does and how to access the funding at the end. Right. So I'll just tell you about myself. I'm 25 years working as an IP lawyer / strategist / educator, I guess. But most of those 25 years, unlike my colleagues in law firms, I've spent in business, building intellectual property, as a client, I guess. But really what you're going to hear me talk a lot today about is the business side of intellectual property, which is almost completely not talked about and almost forgotten in the whole thing. So that's what I want to talk to you today about. Okay, so prior to being in AI, I was in aerospace and spent a long time doing that as well. So I've worked with a lot of engineers and technologists over the years, and hopefully I'm able to leave you with some interesting ideas.
Test. Perfect. Now I'm live. Thank you. It's all great to get where they're going to be coming from. And so the first question I'd like to start off with is really in the name of this title. So when you think about defensibility by design, what does that mean to you? And how early in a startup's journey should founders be thinking about it? And this is an open question to anybody.
I'll jump in. The first thing I want to do is level set on what IP means, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So the way I think about it is that IP is the stuff that comes out of your head, right? That's like ideas, information is things like code, models, that sort of thing. Ideas are like use cases, business models, that sort of thing. And I like to lump data in there as well. So this is what IP is. Every single one of you that's working in an AI space, you're sitting on a mound of IP. You don't have to go looking for it, it's there, okay? And then you say, well, if that's the IP, what are those things like patents and copyrights and things like that? Those are rights, those are legal rights that you can use to sort of, as I say, get your IP working harder, right? To reach your business objectives. So that just the level set on terminology. For startups, because that's what we're talking about here today, intellectual property and IP strategy is not a one-size-fits-all. What you need to do as a startup, as a small company, is not at all what a big company needs to do. And the defensibility side of it is, most people are going to jump to like, how do I protect my idea? But that's not actually your biggest problem. The defensibility are the IP issues, the traps and tricks that can come back to bite you without you realizing it, right? And there's a couple of them, and you know, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the difference between hard tech and AI, but one of the things that you probably already know is that protecting your secrets is like completely fundamental to how you work in AI. And the risk to your secrets is right here below your nose. You are the biggest risk to your secrets. Because unlike in hard tech, where you could say, here's my product, look at it, in AI, you're talking about your product. And if you don't prepare yourself on how to do that, what do? You stand up and tell people how you made it, right? What better way to make yourself redundant than tell somebody what you did, right? You need instead to have a strategy for how you can talk about your product in terms that they actually need to understand, like purchasing decisions, like what is it that you can bring to them, you know? And so you sort of purposefully keep your technology in the background. That's a really big thing that people don't understand, because your competitor, in quotes, is probably the person that you're trying to sell to, your customer. It so often happens that customers decide not to buy with you, but now that they've understood how to make it, they go and make their own, right? So that's shocking to a lot of startups, that their client, their customer, the one they're trying to impress, is the one most likely to walk away, you know, and become a competitor in small c. So, you know, that right there is really big. And another one we'll maybe jump into, I don't want to sort of take up all the oxygen here, but open source is obviously fundamental to how AI works. 1 in 5 open source packages have licenses that will sync your startup. These are the GPL codes, and if you don't understand the risks that they bring to you when it comes time to get funded at the VC stage or later, if you have that stuff intertwined in what you're building, good luck.
I was going to say, I think it's really funny that you said oftentimes your competitors are your clients, because we work with a lot of construction companies, and they're like, this is great, thanks for giving me the blueprint, and then they basically try to like reverse engineer what you're doing. A lot of the times what I would say from a startup perspective in terms of defensibility, and I don't think it's changed actually much since my days at Creative Destruction Lab, which I think was like maybe 8 or 7 years ago, but is really around the data. Like, what data are you sitting on? Is it novel? Is it unique? Is it something that you necessarily can't go out and, you know, license for the sake of it? And we're seeing it a lot right now, especially in large enterprise, because if we look at all the models, what they're doing is they're training on the exact same data sets, you know, the internet. But there's this idea of kind of mono collapse with the models where, you know, they don't necessarily have anything net new to specifically train on. And so from a defensibility side, what we're seeing in terms of startups that have the strongest defensibility is those that have access to unique or novel data sets. Especially when we look here in Alberta, if we think about all of the utilities, all of the energy companies, like they're sitting on decades and decades of IoT, sensor, AMI, SCADA data, OMS data. It's not necessarily always in the perfect form, but once you do some of the cleanup around it, that's a really unique data set that they specifically have and that they can leverage and train models off of, which becomes a little bit of a differentiator from what we've seen in terms of defensibility.
Yeah, I think the short part that I'll contribute is as early as possible, right? How often should you start, or how early should you start? As early as possible. I think I'm a firm believer in roadmaps. So especially in medical device territory, if you're creating something that's going to require advancement of multiple parallel portfolios, so for example, evidence generation, IP creation, filing, as well as R&D, regulatory, product development, et cetera, you want to make sure that you've identified a need for an IP strategy early in your business's formation, and with your founding team or alone, you get an idea of, okay, I've identified a problem. Now that I've identified this problem and I'm thinking about solutioning, what are the things that I might be putting together that could be considered intellectual property that I may want to protect? Having an idea of what that strategy looks like, even from a perspective of how often will I sit down on my day-to-day to identify and categorize what I've been creating, artifacts, documents, as IP, I think is incredibly important. And often as founders, we have so much to do. There's never a shortage of work to do that we forget to do that. So I think if you can do that early and identify what you're producing, and then start to go through the exercise of doing that frequently, you can get ahead of the game and not feel like you're behind. And then for your company too, let's say you've now built, you've identified a problem space, and you're now doing this categorization and identification of potential IP. You also want to do that at your company, because you're not the only one potentially creating IP and creating new documents and creating new artifacts, ideas. So you want to try to instill in your operations, in your culture, that when people are working on something that's cutting edge, that might be unique, that there's a process by which you go through categorization, identification of IP team-wide. I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, that was great. And you really did part of my job there in summarizing some of the points where, when do you think about it? As soon as you can. And defensibility is certainly like a complex kind of system. You really also helped me segue into the next question quite nicely by bringing up healthcare. So, you're working, building AI solutions in that space, and it's one of the most complex and regulated sectors. So what makes protecting innovation in that kind of space so different? And then how do you approach defensibility when the product must also meet that strict regulatory scrutiny?
Yeah, how long do we have? This is a complex space, and I think sometimes different stakeholders will pull you in different directions, and I'll explain. So let's say you are developing models in-house. You are training your models. You got access to some sort of data from somewhere. You're now training these models for some sort of healthcare application. Clinicians want transparency. They want you to publish, and until you've published, the likelihood is they're not really going to take you as a credible product, an effective product, a product that can have impact. So that is all about transparency and going out there and thinking to yourself, well, okay, that's what one of my stakeholders wants. Then regulatory agencies want to make sure that the claims that you're making are backed up with data. That's the basic of it, right? And it's more advanced than that. There's more layers in that. But ultimately, they want to make sure that your product is safe and efficacious, right? And the claims that you're making are backed by data. So you'll have to disclose certain things to them, right? That, again, you can do under NDA, and the FDA and Health Canada are very good with respect to protecting confidential information. But a lot of times, if you put something that might be proprietary about your product in a 510K filing, that now exposes you to your competitors and what you're building. Same idea when it comes to patents. If you're developing models and the model is going to change site to site, customer to customer, patenting that model may not be of any value, even if it was possible in one of the jurisdictions that you're looking to patent it in. And that's a whole other conversation right now. Recently, one of the UK courts had ruled, I think last year, that convolutional neural networks are not patentable, right? That they're not protectable with those traditional vehicles. So I think oftentimes different stakeholders will pull you in different directions, and it's really important for you to be critically analyzing what parts of your IP can be protected with different vehicles. So what can I trademark? What can I potentially have a copyright on? My training materials, my manuals. What could I potentially patent, right? And what won't change? What will become the canonical way of doing things that is so foundational that gives you that defensibility with investors, with your competitors, so that you have that competitive edge and you protect that competitive edge, but you're still transparent so that you can publish for your clinical stakeholders and you can demonstrate safety and efficacy without revealing your secret sauce for the regulators so that it doesn't become public. It's very challenging to balance that, and it requires discussion, analysis, and the creation of strategies which ultimately need to lead to some sort of execution. And by that I mean operational changes, putting together capital and budgets for protecting your IP and working with patent agents and attorneys to talk through what might be possible, doing knockout searches and patentability analysis. I think these are all really, really necessary. And without it, it's very, very challenging to navigate those three worlds effectively.
What I'll just add on top of that is I don't think this regulatory concern is just a health tech thing, right? Because we have AI legislation, regulation coming.
Yeah.
We already have privacy around, personally, PIA, personally identifiable information, health information, and so on. And I think every AI startup has to be thinking about designing for compliance, right? It's not the move fast, break things era is over, right? Nobody's doing that, or at least nobody's investing in that anymore. Nobody wants to invest in broken things. And so it's really important to understand that you get these things right when you build from the beginning.
Yeah.
And it sucks to think about because it's not exciting, but it is the path to success.
Yeah, I was actually listening to a podcast yesterday, BG Squared, so it's Bill Gurley and Brad Gerstner, and essentially they were talking to Sam Altman and Satya, and they were talking about the US and the different regulation and policies that's coming into play. And so if we look at the US, like Trump has basically pulled everything back, and it's a bit of a free-for-all, and at one point he had like a 10-year bill that was like gonna be out there to basically say no one can regulate. But in the absence of that, we're seeing different states come up with their own legislation and their own rules. So for instance, Colorado's coming up with specific rules, whether it be around AI literacy, whether it be around privacy, the same thing in California. And the interesting dynamic between them was like, they're like, oh, we'll figure it out. Because if you think about the market cap of their company, it's like trillions of dollars. But as a startup, it's a much different thing to actually navigate and work through when you're thinking about starting your company. And here in Canada, we'll see, I think it's the end of the 30-day task force is up, so we'll see what kind of comes out from the new Minister of Artificial Intelligence, Evan Solomon. It seems to be promising what might be there, but if we even look at some of our privacy laws in Canada, they haven't been updated in like 22 years. So we missed the .com, we missed, the mobile phone, and now we're missing AI. And so all of those things, again, not sexy or fun to think about, but they do impact you from a startup perspective.
Totally, and that brings me to really another question I want to bring back to you, Todd, because we started with more in the high regulation related stuff, but you've been looking at companies for the last 25 years, and now AI is becoming pretty ubiquitous, and everybody's looking at implementing it within their businesses. And so what I'm wondering is how that's really changed the traditional IP playbook, and that really focused on protection and ownership, and what's that new thing look like from your perspective?
Yeah, and it's a great question because AI, IP, how we look at IP is really different. So if we think of first, let's start sort of what we all kind of understand, right? Hard tech, what I call mouse traps, right? When you build a better mousetrap, your best technology in that product is probably your most important IP. It's in the product. Your competitor can take the lid off. Your competitor can understand how that technology works. They can replicate it. You can discover it in their product when they have replicated it. And really importantly, that technology is fixed when you manufacture and ship that product, right? That technology is not changing. Now, if we flip to AI, you can see where I'm going with this, right? What are you putting into the marketplace? At most, an interface, right? You're putting an interface into the marketplace. That's it. Your technology isn't there, right? Your technology is no longer fixed. May not even be the same next week or next month. And nobody can really reverse engineer it the way they could with hard tech, right? And so that completely changes the paradigm. Our reflex is to say, I want to patent my algorithm. That's probably the worst thing you could patent, is your algorithm. For two reasons. One is, you know what a patent looks like, right? A very detailed description, some pictures, diagrams, tells the whole world how to make it. But there's no patent police. There's nobody that's going to help you enforce that patent if you're lucky enough to get it. And as Arjun mentioned, there's some rules around whether you can patent certain things or not. So nobody's going to help you enforce that. So you have to go and find someone who read your patent and copied it somehow. And you have to have more than just a gut instinct, right? There's a startup that sued MailChimp a couple years ago, got thrown out to the curb very early in the litigation because they had no evidence of what was happening on the email servers of MailChimp. So those kinds of patents are not, not effective at all. And so we have to start talking about different things, something called detectability. We never talked about it with hard tech because it was inherent. You could take off the lid and look inside for the most part. And for those of you that have sort of hard tech involved in your AI businesses, those rules are still going to apply. But for the AI, you have to think about detectability. As a startup, right, is this for a patent that's going to move the needle with your investors, with a potential acquirer, and even just from a defensibility perspective, you have to be able to detect if someone is using that, right? Otherwise, so that really narrows down the kinds of things that you're going to be looking at for a patent perspective. It's going to be things that are sort of evident from, maybe the way that the outputs come, maybe the way the data has to be prepared to go in, the interfaces, the things that you can see. And so you can see that patenting now becomes not the king of the hill the way that it used to be. We talked about secrets already. We talked about the discipline. And Arjun mentioned, like, as your technology is changing, you need to stay on top of, like, what it is that we're trying to protect, like from a secrets perspective, or from a, what are we trying to leverage for opportunities. So these are some things, if you just think about how, compare that mousetrap to, the AI typical product, especially pure play AI. When you look at those differences, you'll start to see the IP ramifications start to really be quite significant.
And I want to open this up to the group because it's moving faster than what kind of almost anything else before it. And so, how are you seeing founders adapt their strategies to keep pace, and where are they falling behind in that?
So Arjun already mentioned one of the really important things, and that is your most important IP, it's not obvious anymore. Like, it used to be my best technology. But newsflash, your clients probably don't even care what your technology is. They care about the value you deliver to them, right? And so in terms of what your important IP is, it's the stuff that supports that value proposition. And I guarantee you that most AI founders don't really know what their most important IP is. They're probably thinking it's like some really cool piece of technology that was hard to get working, but that technology might be, different next week, next month, next year. But that value proposition, if you're creating something sustainable, is still going to be there. So you're now focused on a different part of your business, a different part of your whole, system than what the mousetrap sort of mentality would take you to. And so, even with patenting, if you're going to be patenting, it's not a piece of technology. It's what I like to say is technology in action delivering a customer solution, right? When you patent at that level, the technology can change. It's not easy to do, don't get me wrong. But that's how you need to think about patenting different than just a piece of technology.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is in our space, we work with a lot of companies that are more from like a vertical integration perspective. And there's one company that we're working with, and they're a vertical integrator specifically in internal finance, kind of like back office. And yes, they have defensibility around what they've done, but at the same time, within the finance function, you need to have auditability. So no matter what your model is doing or the decisions it's making, you need to be able to go back and track every single decision. You need to understand how the decisions were made, what weights were specifically given as well, because those are the things that come up even from like a basic, financial audit perspective. And so those are the things that we're starting to see even within our organizations. The other thing that I would say is really interesting is, some of the tools and products we're developing at PwC, a lot of times it's like, okay, we'll work, you'll send us your data. But a lot of clients, depending on if it's government or if it's in another sector, are actually like, we want you to deploy on-prem. So as soon as we deploy on-prem, like, we lose that IP that was there. You can sure kind of create like a remote, turn off mechanism as well. But then my thought is like, is there really value, and this is again from a larger enterprise perspective, around that IP or that technology? Or is the value in the way that you deliver it and the people that you actually bring to the table in terms of what you're doing. And so it's been really interesting for us just kind of seeing some of the differences, especially when we're looking at working with startups or kind of more mature companies and that kind of vertical integration. Because you still need to know and understand how models are making decisions, and regulators are starting to come down pretty hard. Even the Alberta Utilities Commission, they recently put out something for any net new rate case filings. You need to be able to, if you use a large language model to help you in your submission, you need to talk about what model it was, how it made the decisions, not necessarily what it was trained on, but be able to actually back out everything that's there. And so all of a sudden, what might be defensibility for one startup, you're explaining everything. Now it's to a regulator, so who knows what regulator will do with it, but you still have to explain it.
I think you can tell from the conversation that we're having here that this is a complex space. It's a really complex space.
There's no
and I think,
silver bullet.
yeah, and I think one of the things that I should say that, you know, as founders, we are often putting on a hat of various different roles in our companies. We've got to be jack of all trades. We have certain areas of expertise, but if you're lucky, that expertise will be in the IP world. And if it's not, I really do think that there's a ton of value to going out there and working with an expert who can help you do this sort of analysis. You know, defensibility and enforceability, I think, as Todd was saying, is really important. And that is a big part of what you'll do as founders to identify, okay, if this is the mechanism by which I go towards protecting this IP, how defensible is that, right? And I think that's the question my founder and I, or my co-founder and I, ask ourselves all the time, which is we don't want to just file a patent to get investment. That's a waste of money, right? And time, right? And again, in the process, you're disclosing a lot of information that you may otherwise not have had to. And the conversation about, you know, access to healthcare data is really complex, once again. And you know, whether you're working in government, whether you're working in defense, or you're working in healthcare, despite, you know, all the advances that we've had in the consumer space, we're decades behind when it comes to putting in policies for public data access or entrepreneurial commercial data access in a secure, responsible, and ethical way. Although we're having a lot of discussions about it, I think founders and companies that want to move quickly and want to navigate around that challenge for now while regulations and rules are evolving in that space, investigate federated learning, right? Think about how you can take your model to your customer in a manner that allows you to not disclose the inner workings of that model. And there's companies that are creating solutions that allow you to take your model in their secure enclaves to another site and have it deployed, tested, validated. Or if you want to you know, build it in-house because you have that talent and you think that that's going to offer defensibility and further product advancements to your own company, think about building it into your product. But I think if you're one of the founders who thinks you're going to wait, you may not have enough runway. In fact, I'll make a bold statement. I think likelihood is 99% of companies will not have enough runway for our regulators and rule makers to get together and create something definitive that will allow us to navigate this world effectively. So let's figure out together how to navigate around it in the meantime.
If I could I just want to sort of build on something you said, because one of the things that I really try to do with startups, it's intellectual property can get very complicated quickly, especially when we focus on the legal stuff. But that's not your job, right? Your job is to focus on your business. And the one sort of crucial thing I want to point out to you is that intellectual property for established companies, for big companies, is not the same game as for startups, okay? When you're a big company, you have a customer base, you have a product base, you have employees, you have locations.
In-house legal team.
You have in-house legal, you have all kinds of things, right? You have something to protect. When you're a startup, what do you have? A couple of laptops, a line of credit if you're lucky, right? You have nothing to protect. And that's not actually a problem. That's actually allows, so like what do startups care about, right? They care about two things, growth and growth. Those are what you care about. And so intellectual property should be a lever. You should think of it as a lever How does it help me grow? And Arjun mentioned, I don't want to just get a patent because an investor wants a patent. And I understand what you're saying. Like, there are some investors, sorry, you don't have a patent, we're not investing. But if you have the right patent, that can be, again, focused on, intellectual property in action, delivering value to your client. That is something that will attract investors. That is something that will, if you want to get bought, that will attract an acquirer who's making sort of a make versus buy decision. They're like, these guys have a really solid patent. Maybe I need to buy them. And the third thing is, we usually think of patents as keeping people away, but patents, a strong patent in your area can actually attract a collaboration partner who's like, who do I work with in this area, right? So these are not protecting tools. That mindset is sort of like, hide your money under the mattress, I call it. It's not going to grow under there. That's not what you guys are here for. You're swinging for the fences, right? And intellectual property can be that tool to help you grow. So sorry, I have to get on my soapbox there, but that's I think super important. Big company, small company, it's very different. The growth perspective is really what we need to sort of emphasize around intellectual property.
Yeah, and I really glad you made that contrast between big and small. And so when it comes companies, they have entire legal teams. You've highlighted that, those big multinationals. And so, what do you think the founders are doing a good job? What are they doing to make their IP strategy kind of realistic for their size, but also able to hold its ground against these large behemoths?
They're not competing against those large behemoths. They're competing against attrition, right? They're competing against not dying, right? Like at that fundamental level. And it's a harsh way to say it, but that's, you need to grow, right? And you're never going to win a battle with big tech, right? You just can't, right? So you're trying to find a lane and go fast and go far, leverage your intellectual property to get it working harder for you. But the thing that, I'm sorry, I'm having a Rick Perry moment. Can you remind me the question?
What are these founders doing to make an IP strategy that is
okay.
realistic for their size?
Yeah. So IP strategy, I have developed a little tool I call an IP strategy stack, okay? So, the idea is there's 4 boxes piled on top. And you got to start at the ground level, right? Like we all want to live in the penthouse, but not the penthouse of a building that has no foundation or it's sinking into a swamp, right? So what's at the foundation is this thing that Arjun was talking about, identifying your important intellectual property. It's not necessarily, and may not be at all, the most interesting technology that you have, right? But you got to build a strategy around the stuff that matters in your business. So identifying that, and as your technology is changing daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, you need to keep that up to date. You're busy as a founder, but you need to devote that time. You need to make sure you own it, right? Because you're not necessarily, obviously if you have employees, you're going to have an IP ownership clause in your agreement with them, but if you're hiring vendors, working with researchers or whatever, you don't own it just because you paid the bill, right? You need to have contracts with them. Whatever they develop is going to be assigned to you so that you actually own the pieces of the thing that you're building. And then the third thing, I said there's 4 boxes. Third thing is make sure you can use it. So if you have data that you've scraped from somewhere, maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. But if you're going to build an empire on a data set, make sure that you can actually, that this is like you didn't bypass some controls or rip off somebody's data or whatever. And then I mentioned a while ago in open source, GPL codes. So these are codes that if you incorporate them into your solution, you have to take your proprietary solution and publish it, make it open source. And you might think, who's going to find out? The VCs will, because they're going to scan your code. And when they find it in your stuff, 1 in 5 codes have this. So if you're just like merrily building, 20% of your code is probably something that shouldn't be there. They're either going to say take it out, or value of your deal is minus 20 or whatever, right? So, and you're going to say, right, facepalm. So IP strategy is not just that glamour stuff around, what should I patent? There's the hard work that has to go in that stack.
I think Todd said this really well. Founders are so focused on building and growing that really, even if we're at a stage where we have a patent, can we really bankroll a legal battle against Apple
No.
if they decided to copy your
If you have
product?
$10 million, you're not going to spend it on a legal
Right?
suit. I guarantee
So,
you.
so I think the best thing to do at that point is to keep working, building solutions that you believe are going to be impactful for your customers, and if that IP that is being used by your customers is so valuable and that you spread and scale it with a larger customer base, your customers will be one of those entities that will help fight and back you up eventually to say, hey, no, this company created this product, we use this product here, and now this company has grown from $25,000 company to a $50 million company. Not Apple. They didn't do it. So I think if you keep focused on your customer and your problem and keep growing while continuing to protect your IP and figuring out when the right time to defend it is, you'll be in a much better position than if you were starting out the gates thinking, oh yeah, if a Philips decides to copy what I'm building, I'm going to go out and sue them. Well, likelihood is you're not. And the last remaining bucks that you'll have in your bank account will be spent on legal fees.
The other thing I want to say is, like, this may be like intuitive, but when you're going out, especially as a founder, and you're trying to find like the right IP lawyer, make sure that you're talking to the right individuals. Because I find nowadays everyone likes to call themselves an expert. And so if you're building a company within a specific space and like this is what you're focusing on, try and find a lawyer that knows and understands that space, that's worked with early stage companies, because sometimes necessarily going to the big four or like going to like larger law firms isn't necessarily the right approach, and it's going to be really expensive. And so trying to right size who that advice is or what that lawyer is or what kind of groups you're working with, whether it be like Scale AI or Elevate IP, I think those are the things that are really important. And you can't get, and actually they just changed this, but you can't get your legal and IP advice from ChatGPT, right? Like, we all like to use it, it's good, it can be helpful, but like ChatGPT is not an expert. And I think it was this morning or yesterday, they've also stopped any advice for legal, medical, or financial. Like, ChatGPT now will no longer, obviously there's tons of lawsuits and things going on, but don't just think you can talk to a large language model and find out what your IP strategy is, right? Connect to the right groups that are around you.
One final comment here I'll make is, as leaders of your company, also instill the right culture in your teammates to make sure that they're not feeding IP to ChatGPT. Like, your proprietary methods, data, feature weights, like things like these they take so long for you to come up to. Don't feed that into GPT and explain to your teammates, to your staff, the gravity of doing something like that, and why, if they need expertise in certain areas, it's better coming from experts in the field, consultants if you need to hire them, as opposed to going to GPT for advice.
So I do want to shift this conversation a little bit to the investor's perspective, because you highlighted risk, and when investors are looking at putting their dollars into a company, they're going to want to mitigate that risk. And so my first question in this space is for you, Danielle. It's that, sometimes entrepreneurs view the IP strategy as more of like, it's a checkbox that something has to get done, rather than as this like driver for growth. And I'm wondering, from your vantage point as somebody who's worked, with all sorts of corporations and startups on these projects, how can an IP strategy become part of the company's like value story to those investors and to their clients?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'll say I'm not a lawyer. So, but when you're looking at yourself growing as a company, I think it's really important to understand what space you're in. Is it regulated? Is it not regulated? And also understand what you're building. Like you're talking about before, like building the better mousetrap. Like if you are building a hardware and there's some defensibility and IP around that, you definitely want to have a strong strategy around how you're protecting that, how you're keeping those, trade secrets inside the company, and then how you're actually approaching it, especially if you want to scale in commercial and maybe license that out. But a lot of the times, at least a lot of the companies I work with are, software as a service. And when you're building your technology stack, guess what? You're building it on top of Microsoft, and you're building on top of Databricks, and you're using Cursor. And so does it make sense necessarily to have an IP strategy around that? Or does it make sense maybe to have some internal trade secrets or copyright around that? And so I think understanding your space, understanding what your products and services are that you're delivering and who you're delivering that to are things that are really important. But I'm curious, like Todd, and what your thoughts are on that.
So I work with a lot of investors and startups. So an IP strategy is just all of this stuff that we're talking about. It's not something separate. It's identifying, what's your important IP, making sure you own it, making sure that there are no sort of hidden booby traps in, with GPL, or maybe someone's got a patent that might be blocking you. And then on that penthouse level of like, how can we really leverage this into other things? But investors, for the most part, they're not IP experts, and they're not. A lot of them aren't even AI experts, right? So what do they use? They use something, intellectual property though, for a very, very important purpose. And you've heard the expression that investors don't invest in startups, they invest in founders, right? What the intellectual property strategy says about you, there's 3 things that I hear over and over again from investors about what it says to them. First is that it shows sort of like a self-awareness about the founder and the founding team, that they know what they're about, they know what's important and what they're doing, right? The second is it shows a long-term strategy. You're not just trying to get your next round. You're not just trying to get the next pitch in or whatever. You have a long-term vision, right? And the third thing that they use intellectual property as sort of a measure or a proxy for is your innovation culture within your organization, right? So they don't necessarily understand your strategy, and they're not there to judge your strategy, but they know BS when they see it, and they see a lot of it. And if you want to BS an IP strategy, it's not going to work. But if you put the work in on your IP strategy, it's not only going to help you, but it's going to help you, resonate with investors.
Yeah, one other layer to that is how well do you know your competition? Right? If you're trying to make claims about why your intellectual property is unique, why it positions you uniquely with your value proposition, it also shows to investors how much you know about your competition and how much of what you're doing or you perceive what you're doing to be is unique, right? And that is directly, correlated to defensibility. A lot of times, I think early stage founders, first-time founders can think of investors as people who've just got money to burn. And I think that's such a poor understanding of what investment opportunities are. Investors are brilliant individuals, whether first time or second time or seasoned, they will look at your product in the simplest way, your company in the simplest way, but it tells them a lot. And IP strategy is one of those things that you can communicate it simply and communicate to a prospective investor why you're unique and how you're going to be defensible, as well as how you're going to stay ahead of your competition, because this is what's unique about you and this is how you're protecting it.
Actually, I have a question. Have you ever seen an investor make a decision based off of the company's IP strategy, like decided to invest because they had a strong IP strategy? Obviously, there's a multitude of factors, but that was like, they have this is important to us, we're going to invest.
I've never seen an investor that tells you anything that went into their decision. So the answer, unfortunately, is no. But I think it's definitely part of that story that, they do for sure. They all say, we invest in founders, right, in founding teams. And if you're like, IP, so you remember what I said, intellectual property, it's the stuff that comes out of your head. In AI, it's 100% IP. You're running an IP-based business because there's no buildings, there's no trucks, there's none of that other stuff, right? So if you don't have an IP strategy in an IP-based business, you're more likely to get the other decision about how no IP strategy, not interested, right?
I think if you're in a position where you're a startup and you're in a privileged position, you've a lot of capital and you're starting to think about acquisitions, yes, investors can think about investing in you with your plan to acquire IP from other companies because they own patents or they own particular protections on their expertise or value proposition or what they're creating. If investors want to say, yeah, you're going to go buy out company X and it's because they own this patent and then you're going to get that vertical integration, sometimes yes, but often no.
Yeah. Okay.
And I want to take this opportunity to actually flip that question the other way? I know I think I saw one hand up go as an investor, and I think it'd be valuable to get this perspective. What do you find the investors tend to overvalue or misunderstand in these AI-enabled startups?
I don't blame them, but I explained, we talked off the top about the difference between mousetraps and AI. And so, you know, in hard tech, med tech, you know, green technology and all that sort of stuff, a patent is the price of admission, right? If you don't have, you know, as Danielle said, if you don't have patents on your hardware, you know, what are you doing, right? And so when they move over to AI, they don't necessarily appreciate that there's a difference. They just think IP equals patents. We need to see patents, right? And so, you know, Arjun alluded to it. There are sometimes investors who say, you've explained your IP strategy brilliantly, but there's no patent. Sorry, I'm not going to invest in you because you don't have a patent. And so you have two options. I mean, you could file a patent. I wouldn't file my best idea, but there's something called a marketing patent where you file a patent to get a patent to say patent pending. You know, many years ago when I used to work in a firm for clients, I had clients that filed patents just to mark patent pending on their product because it helped them sell product, okay? So that can still work, right? But you're not gonna wanna expose your best idea. So you may, if you keep getting told no because you don't have patents, because that's the investment community that you're dealing with, you may have to make a tough decision, but I certainly wouldn't build that patent around your, you know, sort of your value proposition necessarily, unless you were able to find one of these sort of detectable opportunities within your business. So that's where I think the challenge comes, and I, you know, you can explain, you know, how secrets are like, you know, how you're protecting your secrets until you're blue in the face. But if you don't have a patent, that's just the way that they've been trained, and I don't think you can really solve for that problem.
Yeah, one of the things I've seen that investors overvalue is just the AI itself. Every company now has some form or integration of AI in terms of what they're doing. Most companies won't be building foundation models like the OpenAIs, you know, if we think about Grok, if we think about Anthropic, like you purely do not have the capital behind you and probably the talent to do that. And so when I see companies that are coming up and we're AI powered and we're AI focused, but then you try and talk to them about, you know, well, what models are you using and how are you integrating this? And then how are you protecting, you know, the data that you're working with? And who on your team is technical? And they don't really have an answer. And so I think that sometimes if everything, especially now, and like I love Canva, like slide decks are so much more polished than they used to be. But if you try and uncover and like pull on some of the threads, you know, what they're doing at the heart of their company, like is AI really their competitive advantage? Like it might not be, and that's okay. So I see a lot of investors just kind of overvalue this idea of AI, but then when you look at the founders or if you look at the team, and this happened with one of the first companies I joined and I didn't know, but we had none of the technical expertise in-house, so we didn't truly know if we were building it was the right way. And so sometimes I see investors overvalue that.
That's very, very astute. I think sometimes if you're in the SaaS space and you're in the B2C space, market share and really, you know, fast-growing exponential gains in market share can sometimes offset that requirement for IP because eventually, once you've cornered, you know, a significant part of the market, defensibility is less of a concern. But then the strategy shifts because you've grown as a company, you've got revenue coming in, and you may not be looking to protect and file intellectual property protections for your primary product, which has allowed you to get 80 to 90% market share. But now you're thinking about, well, how can I create my next product, which will be highly defensible, extremely proprietary, and use that 90% market share to capitalize and sell them another product and achieve 80% saturation. So I think it's really important for you to know, are you playing in the B2C space that's SaaS oriented, or are you playing in the B2B space that's SaaS oriented? Because in our case at Symbiotic AI, we're working with hospitals and health systems. That doesn't apply as much as it would in terms of getting market share, until you get to a point where you're probably close to 40 to 50% market share. But for a startup, that's pretty difficult in the first 5 to 10 years of their maturity. Epic right now has approximately 35% of market share of EHRs across. So like this space is so competitive, and there's so many incumbents that sometimes market share can play to your advantage, sometimes patents will.
I just wanted to say one thing because I want to drop a little bit of a bomb here. And we keep talking about, and it's completely understandable because this is how everybody talks about IP protection, defensibility, and you've heard me say, for startups, it's growth and growth and growth. If you think about AI and how we got here, a huge part of AI is open source, right? And people tend to think that open source is the opposite of intellectual property, but it's not. Open source code bases are still copyrighted, and you get to use them because of the licenses. And this is someone whose intellectual property, those code bases, is now driving business value for that business, right? Whether it's traffic to a platform, uptake of something, building community. And quite often, that is the most valuable, in an important sense, intellectual property that those companies have. And it's not protected, right? It's not defensible, but it is leveraged for growth, right? So I just really want to blow up this mindset about protection and defensibility. Those are big company things, right? But even, we hear a lot about Google, Amazon patents. A lot of those patents they're filing are for their open source packages that they're releasing that are driving uptake of their platform, of their cloud platforms and tools. So open source is IP, and it's a great leverage strategy. It's not for everyone, but it is intellectual property strategy, a great one for growth.
We're coming to the top of our 1 hour, so I'm going to ask, if you were to give one final piece of advice for founders building these AI-enabled ventures, what would it be? What would be that nugget of gold you'd leave them with?
I'm a broken record because I just keep hammering the same points, but think about, as a startup, intellectual property as a tool for growth, okay? Tool for growth, how can you use intellectual property to help you achieve your business outcomes, all right? And see everything through that lens. If it's a patent to help you grow. And why does it matter? Because patents are full of words, right? So if you're trying to hide money under the mattress, it's going to show up in your patent. If you're trying to grow, you're going to write that patent differently. And when we talk about patenting, there's a crucial verb we have to understand. Can versus should. On my LinkedIn, if you want to look me up, I publish all kinds of tools such as decision trees about how I should patent, what kind of GPL codes are like a problem to adopt, how to protect secrets. I've just finished a white paper that's going to publish in about a week or two, a guide, 15 ways to talk about your AI without giving away your secrets. So look me up, send me a DM, find it in my featured stuff. It's all there to help you.
And is there anything Scale AI can do?
Yeah, I didn't see the slide. So just a quick plug on Scale AI. So we fund AI adoption and commercialization projects in Canada. If you want to learn more about our funding, and we also have an acceleration stream as well as what we call a first client program, where we help sort of mid-stage startups get their first big client and help offset some of the financial risk around that. This link here, this QR code, will take you to a place to sign up for our weekly webinar, where you will get sort of like a 30-minute of what our different programs are and what it takes to qualify, as well as an opportunity to ask questions. Thank you for that.
It's actually perfectly timely. My advice to founders and others in industry is going to be start early and identify frequently. But also, there's another layer to that, which is oftentimes early stage companies won't have the capital to file and protect, even consult attorneys or patent agents about what they're building. So look for funding opportunities, especially right now, because the federal government and all of our provincial governments have identified a massive gap in productivity and IP protection in Canada. And there are a lot of different programs available, albeit competitive, but if you can put on your analytical hat and think some of these things through, you can put together applications that will help you secure that funding, and then you're not going to an investor and saying, I need money to protect my IP. right? Sure, if they believe it's highly valuable, they might give you some capital and say, okay, let's do this together. But most investors want to see that you've done that already, or at least you've attempted. At least you've attempted to secure funding from, you know, not private investment sources to support this, because there's so much available right now that if you don't do that, you almost come out uninformed.
Yeah. I have two pieces of advice. If you're using any sort of AI platform right now and you're not paying for it, you should immediately be paying for it, because all of that data that you're feeding it or your employees are feeding it is getting used for training data. And if you think that your employees are not using it, they are, like the data shows. And then my second piece of advice would be, it's okay not to be a lawyer. That's totally fine. But please connect within your community. Like, there's really great platforms, organizations. We've talked about Scale AI, talk about Elevate IP. Like, connect within the community, have conversations, be open, be honest. That's one of the things I love about living in Calgary, especially compared to Toronto, is that the community is really here to help you. And like, if they don't have an answer, they might be able to connect you to someone who does. And so don't be afraid to have those conversations.
I do want to give a quick shout out to Elevate IP. They've been instrumental to the progress that we've achieved at Symbiotic AI, not only in terms of, you know, supporting our growth and advancement of IP, but also giving us advice along the way of what seems fishy, what doesn't necessarily make sense. So you go back to it and you review it either with your attorneys, your agents, or even just your advisory board. So I think you know, programs like this are absolutely fundamental to helping us grow.
Yeah, and we're very grateful to be along the journey with many entrepreneurs. We do have educational resources that you can find on our webpage, and there's going to be more and more content being released over time as I work with some experts to get it built out and deploy it so that it's accessible. One thing I'd like to say is I want to try to summarize all of our conversations that we've had today, which have been phenomenal. It sounds like, you know, the best time to start is, if you haven't already, right now. While AI has certainly changed the landscape when it comes to IP protection, some traditional forms of IP protection are still valuable. Keep your eyes and ears open for changes in the regulatory environment, because it's ever growing. And I was actually at another conversation event yesterday with one of our partners, Catapult, who Daniel's here today. And you know, these legal precedents are being set now, so keep track of them, because it could influence, and likely will influence, your business. And you know, there's value in having AI integrated and having an IP strategy, and investors are going to be looking forward to that. And some of them will be, you know, learning new skills to adapt to this ever-changing set of markets. So I feel like I summarized that pretty well. So with that, I would like to have everybody here just thank all of our fantastic speakers with a round of applause. And thank you all for attending. And enjoy the rest of Innovation Week.